January 10, 1945. A burning French village. One American soldier, alone in the frozen darkness, his machine gun glowing red-hot from continuous fire. Around him, ankle-deep brass casings. Before him, a wall of German dead. Behind him, 517 men who would die without his stand. They told him he wasn't fit to fight, poor eyesight, discipline problems, relegated to kitchen duty. But what the army didn't know was that this coal miner from Illinois had spent years training in the deadliest classroom on Earth, 600 feet underground, where a single mistake meant burial alive. In the next 48 hours, he would kill more enemy soldiers than entire platoons, using skills no military manual could teach. This is the story of how a man the army didn't want became one of the most lethal defenders in World War II history. The Alsatian winter of 1945 held no mercy. In the shattered village of Hatton, France, where 90% of the structures stood as skeletal ruins against a slate-gray sky, the temperature hovered just below freezing, and a thin mist clung to the rubble-strewn streets like a funeral shroud. It was January 10th, approximately 1,430 hours, and in what remained of a stone building's second floor, Master Sergeant Vito Bertoldo crouched behind a Browning M1919A4 machine gun, whose barrel had cycled through so many rounds that it glowed a dull, threatening red even in the pale afternoon light. The weapon's sustained fire had transformed it into something almost alive, radiating heat that shimmered in waves despite the bitter cold. Around Bertoldo's boots, spent .30-06 Springfield casings formed piles so deep they reached his ankles, thousands of brass cylinders that clinked and shifted with every movement, a metallic testimony to the unrelenting violence of the preceding hours. His hands, blackened with gunpowder residue and streaked with blood, some his own, most not, maintained their grip on the weapon with mechanical precision. His eyes, those same eyes that had once been deemed too poor for military service, scanned the fog-shrouded approaches to his position with an intensity that transcended mere visual acuity. He was reading the landscape the way he had once read the darkness of coal seem 600 feet beneath the Illinois prairie. By sound, by vibration, by the subtle displacement of air and the almost imperceptible changes in atmospheric pressure that signaled movement even when sight failed. Before him, in the narrow street that wound through Hatton's devastated center, German bodies lay in configurations that spoke of sudden, catastrophic violence. More than 40 men, perhaps as many as 60 or 80 depending on whose count you trusted, had fallen in the killing ground Bertoldo had created. Some lay in the contorted positions of those who had died instantly, cut down by traversing machine gun fire that had stitched across their formations with mathematical precision. Others had crawled toward cover that never materialized, leaving dark trails in the frost-hardened mud. The dead formed their own kind of barricade now, an obstacle that subsequent German assault waves had been forced to navigate, climbing over the bodies of their comrades while Bertoldo's machine gun sang its continuous song of death. This was not how Vito Bertoldo's military career was supposed to unfold. This was not the story anyone had predicted for the coal miner from Decatur, Illinois, the man the army had initially rejected, then accepted only reluctantly, then relegated to the kitchens as a cook because he seemed to represent everything a good soldier shouldn't be. To understand how he came to occupy this position, alone, outnumbered perhaps 100 to 1, defending a position that by all military logic should have been abandoned hours ago, one must descend into the darkness where his real education began, 600 feet beneath the surface of the earth, in the coal mines that had shaped him long before any drill sergeant ever tried. Vito Bertoldo had grown up in Decatur, a city built on corn and coal and the hard labor of men who understood that survival meant respecting forces larger than yourself. He had entered the mines young, as many did during the Depression years, when work was scarce and pride was a luxury few could afford. The descent into the earth was always disorienting for newcomers, the industrial elevator dropping through darkness, the temperature rising as you descended, the weight of the earth above becoming not just a physical fact but a psychological presence, a vast tonnage held in place by timber supports and geological fortune and nothing else. But Bertoldo had adapted quickly. The mine became his classroom, and the lessons it taught were brutal and absolute. 600 feet down, in passages that could be barely wider than a man's shoulders, where coal dust hung in the air so thick you could taste it with every breath, where the only light came from the carbide lamp on your helmet, You learned to see without seeing. Your eyes became almost secondary. What mattered was your ears, trained to distinguish between the normal creaking of timber supports and the subtle, higher-pitched groan that meant a support was failing. What mattered was your sense of touch, your ability to read the texture of the coal face with your fingertips and know where the seam was strong and where it was ready to collapse. What mattered was your sensitivity to vibration, the way a coal cart rolling along tracks 3 passages away transmitted its movement through the stone, the way a roof collapse in a distant section sent a shockwave through the earth that you felt in your bones before you heard it with your ears. Bertoldo learned to navigate in absolute darkness, when his lamp failed or when coal dust explosions snuffed out all light instantly. He learned to move through spaces where disorientation was constant, where the passages twisted and intersected in ways that could trap the unwary, where the only map that mattered was the one you built in your head through careful attention and absolute presence. He learned to detect airflow, the way fresh air moved differently than stale, the way a blocked passage changed the pressure in subtle ways that you felt on your skin before you could articulate what had changed. He learned to sense the presence of other miners by the displacement of air, by the sound of breathing amplified in confined spaces, by the scuff of boots on stone heard 3 corners away. Most importantly, he learned to make decisions under pressure that allowed no margin for error. When you heard that particular creak from the timber above you, you didn't debate or consult or hesitate. You moved, instantly trusting instincts honed by months and years of pattern recognition. When you sensed a structural shift in the coal face, you called the warning without questioning whether you were sure, because hesitation killed. The mind taught a particular kind of calm under existential threat, a clarity that came from understanding that panic was useless, that survival depended on controlled action even when every instinct screamed for flight. These were not skills the Army Recruitment Office in 1941 knew how to value. When Bertoldo tried to enlist after Pearl Harbor, driven by the same sense of duty that moved millions of young men in those weeks, he was rejected. His eyesight failed the standard tests. Years of working in dim light had taken their toll, and his glasses, old and repaired multiple times, couldn't fully compensate. The recruiting sergeant, perhaps seeing the disappointment in the coal miner's face, might have offered the standard consolation: that mining was essential war work, that the nation needed coal as much as it needed soldiers. But Bertoldo wasn't consoled. The rejection stung with a particular intensity for a man who had spent his life proving he could do difficult things, who had worked in conditions that would break most men, who had survived in an environment where weakness meant death. He returned a year later, in 1942, when the military standards had relaxed slightly as the war's appetite for men grew insatiable. This time he was accepted, but the Army, in its bureaucratic wisdom, looked at his age. He was older than the typical recruit, and his thick glasses and his slight frame, hardened by mine work but not imposing by conventional standards, and decided he would serve best as a cook. It was a practical decision, perhaps even a compassionate one. Cooks were essential, after all, and a man with poor eyesight might struggle in combat. Better to put him where his limitations wouldn't endanger others. What they failed to understand was that Vito Bertoldo wasn't built to accept limitations. The discipline problems that soon appeared in his service record weren't the result of malice or defiance for its own sake. They were the friction that occurred when a man accustomed to trusting his own judgment in life-or-death situations was placed in a role he found demeaning. A cook followed recipes and schedules. A miner followed his instincts or died. The 2 mindsets were incompatible, and Bertoldo chafed against the constraints with increasing frustration. But he was also persistent in the particular way of men who have learned that determination outlasts almost every obstacle. He requested transfer to combat duty. Request denied. He requested again. Denied again. He made his case to every officer who would listen, arguing that he could contribute more, that his eyes were good enough, that he was being wasted in the kitchens. Most probably dismissed him as another malcontent, another soldier convinced he was destined for glory who couldn't accept his mundane but necessary role. But someone, somewhere in the chain of command, either saw something in Bertoldo or simply decided to let him prove himself wrong in the most definitive way possible. In December 1944, as the 42nd Infantry Division prepared for deployment to the European theater, Master Sergeant Vito R. Bertoldo was transferred from kitchen duty to Company A, 242nd Infantry Regiment. He was 42 years old, ancient by infantry standards, bespectacled, with a service record that marked him as a discipline problem. His company mates probably regarded him with skepticism at best. The officers who approved his transfer might have expected him to fail quickly, to realize that combat was better left to younger men with better eyes, and to request a return to safer duties. None of them could have predicted what was coming. None of them understood what 600 feet of darkness had taught him. The 42nd Infantry Division, the famed Rainbow Division that had earned its reputation in World War I, arrived in France in December 1944 to find a situation far grimmer than most had anticipated. The German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had thrown Allied planning into chaos. While the main German thrust had been in Belgium, a secondary offensive called Operation Nordwind was about to smash into Alsace, designed to destroy Allied forces in the region and potentially recapture Strasbourg. The villages of Alsace, caught between the German homeland and the French interior, became killing grounds where every street and building was contested with desperate ferocity. Hatton was one such village, strategically insignificant on most maps but critically important on the ground. It sat astride a key route that German forces needed if they were to break through American lines. When the 242nd Infantry Regiment moved into the area in early January 1945, they found a community already devastated by years of war, its population evacuated or dead, its buildings pocked with shellfire and artillery damage. Company A established defensive positions, knowing that German forces would eventually come but not knowing exactly when or in what strength. Bertoldo, still new to the company, was assigned to security detail at the battalion command post. It was not a frontline position. Command posts typically located themselves behind the immediate combat zone, close enough to maintain communication and control but far enough back to avoid direct engagement. For a man who had fought so hard for combat duty, it might have seemed like another bureaucratic slight, another assignment that kept him from proving himself. But Bertoldo accepted it without complaint, perhaps understanding that in combat, positions and roles could change in seconds, that opportunity would come to those who were ready when it arrived. Operation Nordwind began on January 1, 1945, but it took days for the full weight of the German assault to reach Hatton. On January 8th, intelligence reports indicated large German formations moving toward their sector. The nature of these formations, heavy infantry supported by armor, including Mark IV Panzers and Stu G3 assault guns, suggested this would not be a probing attack but a major offensive thrust designed to break through and exploit into the American rear areas. By the evening of January 8th, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. German artillery began systematically pounding American positions, the distinctive crump of 105mm and 150mm shells walking through the village in carefully plotted patterns. The sounds of tank engines, the characteristic diesel roar of German armor, grew louder as darkness fell. Radio intercepts and scout reports painted an increasingly dire picture. The Germans were committing significant forces, perhaps an entire regiment or more, to taking Hatton. They intended to overwhelm the American defenders through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The battalion commander faced a terrible calculation. His command post, located in one of the more intact buildings in Hatton's center, contained maps, communication equipment, codebooks, and the staff officers necessary to coordinate the defense. If the command post fell or was forced to evacuate in disarray, it could unravel the entire defensive position. But if the German assault was as strong as reports suggested, keeping the command post in its current location might mean its destruction and the capture or death of irreplaceable command personnel. The decision was made to evacuate the command post to a more secure location further back, to establish new defensive lines and attempt to coordinate a fighting withdrawal if necessary. It was a sound tactical decision, probably the only decision that made sense given the intelligence picture. But it created an immediate tactical problem. The evacuation would take time, and a disorganized withdrawal under fire could be disastrous. Someone needed to stay behind to maintain a rear guard, to hold the position long enough for the command staff to extract safely with their equipment and documents. The battalion commander called for volunteers. In that moment, in the gathering darkness of January 8, 1945, with German artillery shells exploding closer with each salvo, Vito Bertoldo stepped forward. He would stay. He would hold the position. He would cover their withdrawal alone if necessary. Perhaps the officers accepted his offer because he was expendable, the 42-year-old with poor eyesight and a discipline problem, not a young soldier with potential. Perhaps they accepted because they saw something in his eyes, some quality that suggested he meant what he said. Perhaps they simply had no better option and no time to debate. Whatever their reasoning, they accepted. They gave him a Browning M1919A4 machine gun, a weapon that weighed 31 pounds unloaded and 41 pounds with a full belt of ammunition, a weapon designed for sustained fire with a maximum rate of 600 rounds per minute, a weapon that could kill at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards if handled properly. They gave him as much .30-06 ammunition as he could reasonably use, boxes of belted rounds, each belt containing 250 cartridges, each cartridge capable of punching through steel plate at close range. They wished him luck, though luck seemed an inadequate commodity for what he was about to face. And then they left. The command staff, moving with organized urgency, loaded vehicles and began their withdrawal as darkness completed its descent over Hatton. Within an hour, Bertoldo was alone in a building in the center of a mostly destroyed village, with a machine gun, several thousand rounds of ammunition, some grenades, his rifle, and his instincts. The cold settled in with the darkness, the kind of cold that penetrates through wool and cotton and leather, that makes metal painful to touch, that turns breath into visible clouds and moisture into ice. Bertoldo positioned his machine gun carefully, understanding fields of fire and angles of attack in ways that came from instinct rather than classroom instruction. He could not see far in the darkness. His poor eyesight and the absence of moon or stars saw to that, but he could hear everything. Around 0500 hours on January 9th, perhaps 5 hours after the command post evacuated, the German attack began. Bertoldo heard them long before he saw them. The diesel engines of the half-tracks, the distinctive sound carrying clearly in the cold air. The crunch of boots on frozen ground, dozens or hundreds of men moving in formation. The metallic sounds of equipment, of rifles and machine guns, and the particular clink of ammunition pouches. He heard them organizing in the darkness perhaps 100 or 200 meters away, officers calling orders in German, NCOs positioning their men for the assault. Every instinct from the mine came alive. He wasn't seeing the attack develop. He was feeling it, sensing it through sound and vibration and the displacement of air. He tracked their movement by ear, building a mental map of where they were, how many, what their likely approach routes would be. His hands on the machine gun were steady, his breathing controlled. He had spent years in situations where one mistake meant death, where you held your position until the exact right moment and then acted with decisive violence. This was no different, he told himself. This was just another section of the mine, just another situation where survival meant trusting your training and not flinching when the moment came. The German half-tracks advanced cautiously, perhaps expecting resistance but not knowing exactly where the American positions were. They moved down the street that led toward the former command post location, their engines roaring in low gear, infantry moving alongside in the darkness. Bertoldo waited. The mine had taught him patience, the ability to hold absolutely still while danger approached, to let it come close enough that your action would be decisive. The lead half-track stopped perhaps 15 to 20 meters from his position. In the darkness, he could see its vague outline, could hear the engine idling, could hear the voices of the German soldiers conferring about whether to advance or hold. Other vehicles were behind it, a whole column compressed into the narrow street. Infantry flanked the vehicles, perhaps 30 or 40 men in his immediate field of fire. Bertoldo opened fire. The Browning M1919A4 erupted in a 6-second burst that shattered the silence like a hammer through glass. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness in flat, lethal trajectories. The .30-06 rounds, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, tore through the German infantry with catastrophic effect. Men died before they could process what was happening, cut down in groups by the traversing fire. 8 men. 10 men. Possibly more in those first 6 seconds, bodies dropping in a wave as the machine gun swept across them. The survivors reacted as trained soldiers do. They sought cover, returned fire, attempted to locate the source of the ambush. But Bertoldo had chosen his position well, with solid stone providing protection and multiple angles of fire. When they tried to advance, he fired again. When they tried to flank, He repositioned slightly and caught them in the open. The machine gun's sustained fire was devastating in the confined space of the village street. The German half-track, unable to turn around quickly in the narrow space and unwilling to advance into certain fire, became an obstacle for the vehicles behind it. For hours, through the absolute darkness before dawn, Bertoldo fought alone. Wave after wave of German infantry attempted to assault his position or bypass it. Each time, he heard them coming before they arrived, his senses attuned to every sound and movement. Each time, the machine gun spoke, and men died in the darkness. The spent casings accumulated around his position, hundreds and then thousands of brass cylinders, still warm enough that they steamed slightly in the cold air. The Germans brought up mortars, the distinctive hollow thump of 81mm rounds being fired somewhere in the distance. Bertoldo heard them coming, the whistle of shells in flight, and read their trajectory the way he had once read the pattern of falling rock in unstable mine sections. He moved before impact, dragging the heavy machine gun to a different position, continuing to fire from new angles. The mortar rounds exploded where he had been seconds before, bringing down already weakened walls, filling the air with stone fragments and dust. As dawn broke on January 9th, the situation became simultaneously clearer and more desperate. With increasing light, Bertoldo could see what he was facing, and it was worse than even the sounds had suggested. German forces had committed what appeared to be several companies to taking Hatton, perhaps 300 or 400 men, supported by armor that included several Mark IV Panzers and at least one Stu G3 assault gun. The village was almost completely surrounded. Bodies from the night's fighting lay in groups and lines where the machine gun had found them. The German commanders, seeing the devastation a single machine gun had inflicted in darkness, now prepared to reduce Bertoldo's position with methodical, overwhelming firepower. The panzers advanced into range and began firing their 75mm main guns directly at the building Bertoldo occupied. The shells were high explosive, designed to destroy fortifications, and they began systematically demolishing the structure. The first shell took out part of the second floor, the explosion so loud and violent that it temporarily deafened Bertoldo. Stone and timber and dust filled the air. The entire building shook, and Bertoldo understood immediately that staying in this position meant death. Not from small arms but from direct fire that would eventually bring the entire structure down on him. He relocated, a process that should have been suicidal but which he accomplished through a combination of speed, timing, and the fact that the Germans probably couldn't believe a single soldier was causing this much damage. He moved the M1919A4, 41 pounds of weapon and ammunition, through the rubble of the destroyed building, across an exposed space that German riflemen immediately filled with fire, and into the shell of what had once been a bakery. Bullets struck stone around him, the distinctive crack of Mauser rifles and the heavier thump of MG42 machine guns. He felt the impacts through the stone, felt the particular vibration that told him how close the rounds were coming. Inside the bakery, he set up at a window that provided a different angle on the German approach. The panzers were still firing at his previous position, unaware he had moved. He waited until German infantry, thinking the position suppressed, began advancing more openly. Then he opened fire again, and more men died, and the German attack faltered as soldiers dove for cover and officers tried to understand how the American position was still active. The day wore on with relentless intensity. The Germans, perhaps angry now, perhaps desperate to silence the single machine gun that had already killed dozens and disrupted their entire offensive timetable, committed more forces. They called in more mortar fire, and the shells walked through Hatton in careful patterns, exploding in sequences that turned buildings into rubble and filled the air with choking dust. Bertoldo moved again, always hearing the shells coming, always finding new positions, always continuing to fire. The machine gun began to malfunction. After thousands of rounds, even the robust M1919A4 started to experience problems. The barrel was overheating despite the cold, the sustained fire pushing it beyond its normal operating parameters. Bertoldo had no spare barrel to swap. That luxury belonged to weapons with full crews and support. He had to manage the heat by firing in shorter bursts, by timing his fire to allow cooling, by accepting that the weapon might fail at any moment. And it did fail repeatedly. The belt feed jammed, a round catching in the mechanism. Bertoldo cleared it with movements made automatic by hours of practice, his hands moving over the weapon without conscious thought. 18 seconds to clear the jam and resume firing. It jammed again. 18 more seconds. Then again. Each jam occurred while German infantry was moving, while he was vulnerable, while the Germans could have rushed his position if they had realized the fire had stopped. But each time, he cleared the malfunction and resumed firing before they could capitalize. His water was frozen in his canteen, a solid block of ice that was useless for drinking or for cooling the machine gun barrel. He had no food. He hadn't thought to grab any before the command post evacuated, and even if he had, there was no time to eat. His hands were raw, bleeding from the hot barrel and the sharp edges of ammunition boxes. His ears rang constantly from the concussion of gunfire and explosions. His eyes, already poor, were further compromised by the smoke and dust that filled every space, that made breathing and exercise in controlled choking. But he kept fighting because stopping meant death, and because somewhere in the calculations running through his exhausted mind was the knowledge that every hour he held was an hour the battalion command post used to reestablish itself, to organize a proper defense, to save the 517 men whose lives depended on his stand. The Germans brought up their Stu-G3 assault gun, a squat, ugly vehicle mounting an 88mm gun that was designed to destroy bunkers and fortified positions. The 88mm was legendary, a weapon that could penetrate any Allied armor and could reduce buildings to rubble with terrifying efficiency. When Bertoldo heard its distinctive engine note and saw its profile moving into position, he understood that his options had just narrowed to almost nothing. The Stu-G fired. The 88mm shell struck the bakery with apocalyptic force. The explosion was beyond anything Bertoldo had experienced, beyond the panzer shells, beyond the mortar rounds. The building didn't just shake. It partially disintegrated. Walls collapsed inward. The ceiling came down in sections. The shockwave picked Bertoldo up and threw him across the room like a rag doll, slamming him into what remained of the far wall hard enough to crack ribs and drive the air from his lungs. He lay there for seconds or minutes. Time became fluid in the ringing silence that followed the explosion. Unable to move, unable to breathe, convinced that he was dying or already dead. Dust and smoke choked the air so thick that inhaling was like breathing mud. His ears registered only a high-pitched whine, the sound of damaged hearing. His vision swam, doubled, refused to focus. Blood ran from his nose and mouth, whether from external wounds or internal injuries he couldn't tell. The machine gun lay several feet away, partially buried in rubble. When Bertoldo finally managed to crawl to it, pulling himself across broken stone with arms that barely functioned, he discovered that the weapon was destroyed. The 88mm shell's concussion had warped the receiver, had bent the barrel, had rendered it completely inoperable. His primary weapon, the weapon that had killed 40 or more Germans over the past 18 hours, was now just 30 pounds of twisted metal. He could hear German voices, much closer now, calling to each other in that organized way that meant a coordinated assault. They were coming, finally convinced that the position was neutralized, ready to finish whatever remained. Bertoldo, wounded and disoriented but not dead, not unconscious, not defeated, found his grenades. White phosphorus grenades, designed for smoke screening but equally effective as anti-personnel weapons, particularly brutal in their effects. He waited until he could hear the boots on rubble, until the German infantry were close enough that missing would be almost impossible. Then he threw the first grenade through the destroyed window. The white phosphorus exploded in a burst of burning particles that ignited on contact with air, that burned at 5,000 degrees, that couldn't be extinguished by water or smothering, that would burn through clothing and flesh and bone until the chemical reaction exhausted itself. The screaming started immediately, German soldiers hit by phosphorus fragments that clung and burned, that caused injuries so horrific that death was sometimes a mercy. He threw another grenade, and another. The German assault wavered, broke, fell back as soldiers who had been advancing into what they thought was a neutralized position found themselves facing a new nightmare. Bertoldo, moving on instinct and will because his body was failing, found his M1 Garand rifle, the standard weapon he'd carried as backup. 8 rounds in the clip, semi-automatic fire, effective to 500 yards. He fired at shapes moving through the smoke and dust, the distinctive ping of the empty clip ejecting after 8 rounds, reloading, firing again. The day passed into afternoon. Bertoldo moved through the ruins of Hatton like a ghost, no longer holding a fixed position because there were no fixed positions left to hold, fighting from rubble pile to ruined building to shell crater. He had no clear idea of how many Germans he was facing, no real understanding of the tactical situation beyond the immediate reality that they were trying to kill him, and he was trying to prevent that while slowing their advance. At some point, whether it was late on January 9th or early on January 10th became unclear, time having lost its usual structure. Bertoldo realized he could no longer see properly even by his limited standards. Blood had run into his eyes, or the concussion had affected his vision, or exhaustion had simply degraded his remaining capability. He was navigating by sound again, by feel, by instinct, fighting in near blindness the way he had once worked in the absolute darkness of the mine. He heard them more clearly than ever, though heard every movement and position with an acuity that bordered on supernatural. When German soldiers whispered to each other 20 meters away, he heard the words even without understanding German. When they moved, he heard the direction and distance and number. When they prepared to fire, he heard the metallic sounds of weapons being readied. The mine had given him these skills, and now, at the edge of death, they were sharper than ever. The fighting continued through January 10th. At some point, Bertoldo returned to the original command post location, or what remained of it, finding more ammunition among the ruins, finding the destroyed machine gun, crouching behind a pile of rubble that offered minimal cover but a clear field of fire across the approaches. He was barely conscious, functioning on some level below conscious thought, his body continuing to fight even as his mind began to shut down from exhaustion and blood loss and accumulated trauma. When American forces finally counterattacked and began pushing into Hatton on January 10th, they expected to find a destroyed village fully occupied by German forces. What they found instead was a scene of such devastation that it took time to process. German bodies lay in heaps and lines, concentrated in the village center in patterns that spoke of machine gun fire and explosions. Equipment lay abandoned. Weapons, ammunition, supplies scattered across a battlefield that should have been a German victory. And in the ruins of a stone building that had once been the battalion command post, they found Master Sergeant Vito Bertoldo. He was barely alive, slumped behind the destroyed M1919A4 machine gun, still clutching it despite its uselessness, his uniform so covered in blood and gunpowder and soot that it was almost black. He had sustained multiple wounds, shrapnel, concussion injuries, possibly gunshot wounds among the various traumas. He had not slept in roughly 48 hours. He had fought alone against forces that numbered in the hundreds, had held a position that every tactical manual would have declared indefensible, had killed more enemy soldiers than most infantry squads accounted for in entire campaigns. The American soldiers who found him stood silent for a moment, trying to comprehend what they were seeing, trying to reconcile the single man with the field of dead that surrounded him. When they finally approached him, speaking his name, Bertoldo looked up with eyes that barely focused, that struggled to recognize friendly forces after 2 days of killing anything that moved. "Is the command post safe?" he asked, or something like it, the exact words lost to history but the meaning clear. After everything, after holding against impossible odds, his first concern was whether he had accomplished his mission. They assured him that the command post was safe, that the evacuation had been successful, that the battalion had reorganized and held its lines. They told him, though he might not have fully processed it at the moment, that his stand had saved 517 men, that his action had prevented a German breakthrough that could have rolled up the entire sector. The German dead around his position numbered at least 40 by the most conservative count. Some estimates based on battalion after-action reports suggested 60 to 80, though the chaos of the battlefield and the fact that Germans had evacuated some casualties made a precise count impossible. What was certain was that one man, armed primarily with a single machine gun and his own determination, had inflicted casualties on a scale that typically required multiple infantry squads or artillery support. The citation for the Medal of Honor, which Vito Bertoldo received for his actions at Hatton, reads with the dry precision of military documentation, but beneath the formal language lies the recognition of something extraordinary. It notes his voluntary decision to remain behind alone, his continuous engagement of numerically superior enemy forces, his refusal to withdraw even when wounded, his critical contribution to preserving American defensive positions. It does not capture, because official citations cannot, the full measure of what he did, the hours of sustained combat, the countless individual decisions each of which could have meant death, the stubborn refusal to accept that one man could not hold against hundreds. Bertoldo survived the war. He returned to Illinois, to Decatur, to a life that must have seemed almost impossibly quiet after what he had experienced. He carried his wounds and his memories, as all combat veterans do, but he also carried the knowledge that when the moment came, when everything depended on one man holding one position, he had not failed. The coal mines had prepared him for darkness and danger and the necessity of absolute presence. The war had given him the opportunity to prove that his persistence, his insistence that he could contribute more than the army initially believed, had been justified. The story of Vito Bertoldo is not well known outside military history circles. He is not among the household names of World War II, not celebrated in the same way as some other Medal of Honor recipients. Perhaps this is because his action was defensive rather than offensive, holding rather than attacking, or perhaps it is simply the accident of historical memory that elevates some stories and allows others to fade. But for those who study close combat, who understand the psychological and physical demands of sustained defensive fighting, who recognize the intersection of training, instinct, and will that allows men to perform beyond normal human limitations, Bertoldo's stand at Hatton represents something essential. It represents the value of experience that military training cannot replicate, the skills learned in 600 feet of darkness that proved more valuable than 20/20 vision. It represents the vindication of a man who refused to accept others' assessment of his limitations, who insisted on the opportunity to prove himself even when that proof might cost his life. Most fundamentally, it represents the reality that in war, in those moments when everything balances on the edge of disaster, the men who survive and triumph are often not the ones who look most like soldiers in garrison. They are the men whose previous lives have taught them skills no manual contains, whose instincts run deeper than training, who understand at a level below conscious thought that survival is not about strength or perfect eyesight or youth. It is about presence, about calm under pressure, about the refusal to quit even when quitting seems rational. Vito Bertoldo, the coal miner from Decatur, the cook the army didn't want, the 42-year-old with poor eyesight and discipline problems, had all of these qualities. At Hatton, in January 1945, he proved it in the most definitive way imaginable, and 517 men lived because he did. If this story moved you, if it revealed a piece of history you'd never heard, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another untold story of courage and sacrifice.